Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Ellen Weiss. I am the Executive Director for the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. We are thrilled to be offering you this webinar today on conducting implementation research and impact studies of education and interventions, along with our co-sponsor, the Association of Public Policy and Management. A few housekeeping items. This is the fourth webinar in the series on applying standards for excellence in education research that have started in May 2022. We have the recordings for the previous webinars on our website, and we will drop those in the chat for you. For today, we will be taking questions in the chat. We ask that you remain on mute. And the moderators will be bringing those questions to the speaker's attention if needed during the session, but mostly at the end. If you need to turn on closed captioning, there is a CC. It's on the bottom of my screen. It might be under the more on your screen. Depends where you have your menu bar. You can turn that on so that you have closed captioning on your device. If this topic is of specific, you're really interested and you'd like to dig in further, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness' annual meeting is in September in Arlington, Virginia, and we'll be offering a workshop on this topic that Lauren Scher, who I will turn it over to in a minute, said will offer some more hands-on activities on the same topic. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. Lauren's work focuses on K-12 education and family support programs and policies, particularly those targeted towards at-risk children and youth. She is at Mathematica, and she is going to take over from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. So before we start, we'd like to thank the Institute of Education Sciences, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, and APAM, and Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management for co-sponsoring the event, where we're going to be talking today about a new guide that was just published by IES in June. If we want to just go to the next slide, thank you. So Carolyn Hill and I are going start our discussion today by providing a guide and key issues researchers need to consider when designing an implementation evaluation connected to an impact study of an education intervention. We'll then get to the meat of things by hearing from our invited panelists who've been in the trenches and can discuss their experiences with particular issues related to measuring fidelity, assessing implementation contrasts, and integrating implementation and impact findings. And after that, after the panelists each speak, we'll then engage in what I'm betting will be a lively panel discussion, followed by audience Q&A. And remember to use the chat function to submit any questions. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay. So as Ellen mentioned, this webinar is the fourth in a series of presentations connected to putting IES's standards for excellence in education research, or SEER, into practice. The SEER were developed and have been promoted by IES to encourage researchers to think beyond simply designing internally valid studies, but also thinking about how to design and carry out studies that are going to yield relevant and actionable evidence. The SEER standards cover 9 different topic areas. If you want to go to the next slide. Today, we're going to focus on one of those, documenting treatment, implementation, and contrast. And as you can see in this slide, once you go to the SEER website, which we're going to provide the link in the chat, you'll notice that for each of the SEER standards, IES provides a description of the standard and provides recommendations for resources to help researchers incorporate the SEER into their work. So we'll go on to the next slide. Although this is likely intuitive for many of you attending today, I'd like to talk very briefly about why it's important to conduct implementation research as part of an impact study. Implementation research supports researchers in producing nuanced study results that can help practitioners understand what might work in their context and what might help support successful implementation. Implementation study findings are particularly useful in helping make sense of where, for example, of situations where, for example, impact studies show null or negative effects or show positive effects in some settings, but not others. For example, some sites might implement an intervention with greater fidelity than other sites, or some sites may be in a situation where the control group receives similar services as the treatment group, and making it really hard to detect differences between the groups. Also, when impact studies show strong positive effects, solid implementation research findings provide practitioners with actionable information to support successful implementation in their own settings. Implementation details also help support researchers who are looking to synthesize evidence across studies to examine which interventions or intervention components are associated with impacts. Hopefully I've sold you. If so, then you might want to download the new guide. If you want to move to the next slide. The guide was commissioned by IES and published in June. We're grateful to IES and to the numerous expert reviewers who provided helpful comments and suggestions during the development, and who we acknowledge in the guide. And we'll provide the link to the guide in the chat if we haven't already. I haven't been looking at the chat. So we'll go to the next slide. Carolyn's going to soon provide more specifics, but generally, the intent of the guide is to serve as an introduction to designing and conducting implementation research as part of impact evaluations. It provides definitions, practical templates, and a wide range of examples, including examples that cover interventions with multiple components or interventions that target a single component. We also provide examples of studies of interventions in different settings, for example, pre-kindergarten, K through 12, post-secondary. And in particular, the guide walks the reader through an in-depth example of a hypothetical evaluation of a pre-kindergarten program. The guide is intended to be helpful to a broad audience. It can support students in graduate training programs or researchers who are early in their career, as well as those who are seasoned researchers but have limited experience with implementation research. It also provides links to resources to additional scholarly literature that can help researchers dive deeper than what's offered in the guide itself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn, who's going to provide a bit more information about what's in the guide. So Carolyn?
Thank you, Lauren. All right, so I'll begin by providing an overview of the guide's conceptual framework, which is shown in Exhibit 1, and that's available on page 6 in the guide. And after we walk through this framework, we'll share some slides that focus on each section a bit more. This framework traces a path, which we'll see once we uncover it, from the planned intervention to impacts. It's an adapted version of the conceptual framework developed by Mike Weiss, Howard Bloom, and Tom Brock in their 2014 article in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. We'll start on the right-hand side of the figure with a familiar idea. An estimated impact is the difference between average outcomes for the intervention group and the control group. The control group outcome provides an estimate of the counterfactual, or the intervention group's outcomes in the absence of the intervention. Click, please. As shown in this part of the framework, impacts are driven by differences in intervention model components that are received by the intervention group and relevant services that are received by the control group. The guide refers to this difference as the intervention contrast. Other terms for it in the literature include service differential, program differentiation, and achieved relative intervention strength. Even if an intervention has a strong logic model and is implemented well, impacts may not be evident if the control group accesses similar services as the intervention group. The guide section 4 discusses intervention contrast in greater detail, and during today's webinar, panelist Catherine Darrow will focus on this aspect. Click, please. The upper left section of the framework focuses on the intervention model itself. It depicts the intervention model as composed of direct components and support components. Direct components involve direct interaction with the intended population whose outcomes are hypothesized to change as a result of the intervention and whose impacts your study will measure. Support components are the strategies, resources, or preparation that activate the direct components in the study and that are specified as part of the intervention model. We can think of each type of component in 3 stages: as they're planned or designed, as they're offered to members of the intervention group, and as they're received by members of the intervention group. As shown here, the guide defines intervention fidelity as the correspondence between the planned and offered intervention components. The guide section 2 discusses specifying intervention model components and measuring fidelity in greater detail. And during today's webinar, panelist Barbara Goodson will focus on some common issues with measuring fidelity. Click, please. Context features are shown across the bottom of the framework. These features include broad categories of organizational and system characteristics, intended population and participant characteristics, and external environment characteristics. Section 3 of the guide discusses context in greater detail. Next slide, please. Next, we'll share one slide for each section of the guide, briefly mentioning the subsections covered in each. We'll also share snapshots of the different kinds of resources that Lauren mentioned earlier that are available in the guide. These include definitions, examples, templates, and links to further resources. They occur throughout the guide, and we'll just give you a little snapshot for how they might appear in each section. Section 1 of the guide discusses establishing implementation research questions and beginning to develop an analysis plan. It includes a subsection on specifying research questions about intervention implementation, context, contrast, and associations with impacts. It provides 4 broad research questions that you can tailor to your study. A second subsection discusses developing a data collection and analysis plan for the study's implementation research. It emphasizes developing this plan early on in the study and revisiting it and updating it as needed, collaborating with other members of the research team. The right-hand side of this slide shows an excerpt from Exhibit 3, which you can find on page 14 of the guide. This exhibit lists each of the 4 broad implementation research questions and shows detailed examples of them for the hypothetical pre-K intervention discussed in the guide that Lauren mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Section 2 of the guide discusses specifying details about the intervention and its implementation. The guide discusses specifying the intervention's planned components, both direct components and support components, as noted earlier in the discussion of Exhibit 1, as well as dimensions of each component. These dimensions are content, quantity, mode, and quality. Carefully thinking through and articulating details of the planned intervention model components and their dimensions can help clarify your research questions, your plans for data collection, and your plans for analysis. A second subsection addresses identifying data sources for measuring the offer and receipt of both direct and support components. And a third subsection addresses specifying how your study will measure intervention fidelity. That is, the correspondence between planned and offered components. As noted, Barbara Goodson will build out from information in the guide in her comments in just a bit. The right-hand side of the box of the slide shows box 2, which you can find on page 17 of the guide. And it's an example of a resource, in this case, for recognizing and specifying adaptations to an intervention model. It includes just a few examples of adaptations here and also a link to an article with detailed discussion and further examples. Next slide, please. Section 3 of the guide discusses specifying details about context. These are the features depicted across the bottom of Exhibit 1. One subsection discusses identifying context features that are most likely to moderate implementation and impacts in your study sites. The second subsection discusses identifying data sources and measures for context features. Both sections provide a number of resources and references for further detail. The right-hand side of this slide shows a snapshot from the section's introduction, which is on page 30 of the guide. And this is just a brief example of one of the features in the guide, that is providing terms and definitions. and importantly, crosswalks to the definitions and terminology found in other sources like the implementation science literature. Next slide, please. Section 4 of the guide discusses specifying details about intervention contrast, depicted in the middle of Exhibit 1. Subsections discuss prioritizing aspects of the intervention contrast for information gathering and identifying information about and data sources for the intervention contrast. Also, as noted, Catherine Darrow will be diving further into intervention contrast in just a bit. The right-hand side of the slide here shows an excerpt from another type of resource found throughout the guide, templates for recording and organizing information during your study. This is an excerpt from Exhibit 7, which is found on page 40 of the guide, which shows how studies can keep track of components and data sources for collecting information from intervention and control groups. Next slide, please. Section 5, which is the last section of the guide, takes an overarching look across Exhibit 1 and the other sections of the guide, discussing a range of issues of how to analyze and report details about the intervention and its implementation as part of an impact study. It's important to note that there's not a standardized way to report these details, and it depends on the intervention, the study context, the range of decisions the study is designed to inform, and the audience for specific products. With this in mind, the section discusses addressing each broad research question using appropriate qualitative and quantitative methods. The guide provides basic definitions and resources for conducting qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods analyses, and for examining variation and impact estimates. Building out from information in the guide, later in the webinar, Howard Bloom will discuss integrating information from implementation research with understanding variation and impacts. The last subsection provides numerous examples from published studies of how to report findings in ways that support their future use. It also provides links to reporting guidance from various sources. Next slide, please. As noted, the guide provides a kind of 101 level of guidance. So we aim to have the guide really lay out the basics across a wide range of information. And we're looking forward to the 3 panelists today to provide a 201 plus version of some of the topics. Our first panelist is Barbara Goodson from Apt Associates. Information about Barbara's experience is available in her bio, which is pasted in the chat. Barbara, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing from you about how to address some common issues when measuring intervention fidelity.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. And I think we can go to the next slide right away. I want to say that the being in the trenches is an excellent metaphor for, I think, the work that has been happening on implementation. I've had the enviable and elucidating experience of being able to work on fidelity measures with more than 300 programs as part of the EIR and I3 grant programs. And so I feel that I've struggled with this issue of fidelity for quite a while. As Carolyn showed in the exhibit, the fidelity has a high priority position in the overall implementation evaluation framework as being a key metric for understanding the contrast between the treatment and the control or comparison group, and as a way to help understand variation. And as you said, fidelity really tells us what the members of the treatment group are actually experiencing in terms of their receipt of the full planned intervention model. And despite the priority for measuring fidelity, I think it's been one of the most challenging aspects of implementation evaluation to date. And I think that one of the reasons it's challenging is, as Carolyn mentioned, there really isn't guidance about exactly the right way to define, measure, or report fidelity. But I think in particular, the issue that really strains people's thinking is about this idea of a threshold, which we'll talk about in a minute, as one of the most important challenges and things to solve when people are developing a measure of fidelity. There are also more nuanced problems that come up in measurement when you have interventions that go across multiple years or cohorts, how you actually talk about fidelity. Also, when the further complication happens, that there is either a planned or an unplanned adaptation of the intervention model and how that affects how you measure fidelity. And finally, the important and probably to date under studied aspect of variation in fidelity and how learning about variation can help improve the intervention model. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to talk a minute about this issue of defining a threshold. And if we understand that fidelity is the match between the intervention as planned and the intervention as offered and then received, when developing a measure of fidelity, researchers need to actually develop a metric for how close those have to be in order for them to feel that implementation has been adequate. In other words, the model has been implemented with adequate fidelity. And understanding how to set that threshold is often problematic because there typically are not data available to understand where exactly the cut point would be in terms of getting enough of an intervention for it to be considered a high fidelity. And so the kind of sources that people look to are, number one, what is the definition of full implementation of the component as planned? That is, there is no threshold. You need to get all of whatever the planned amount of each support component or direct component is, or it's not high fidelity. Other people look to implementation data from prior investigations of the same or similar interventions, looking for the mean or median or modal level of implementation actually achieved, and using that as an idea of what might be a reasonable threshold. Or that in an intervention where there isn't prior data, often researchers look at the level of implementation that was actually observed. For example, how many people actually came to the training or how many teachers actually implemented the lesson plans, and use that to help set a threshold after being able to observe the intervention. So let's go to the next slide. Thinking about the threshold is often in terms of developing a measure, but once you actually try to use that measure to assess fidelity, there are many complications in the field that researchers have to deal with. Particularly in the programs I've looked at, many of the programs are either multi-year interventions, either because the intervention itself takes multiple years to complete, or the study of fidelity goes across multiple cohorts of multiple years. And then the question is, can fidelity be measured the same way every year? Or should some years be given greater weight than others? For instance, some people believe that in a second year of implementation of an intervention should be given more weight than the first year, which may be working out some of the kinks in the implementation of the intervention. So there are questions for which there is no given answer about how you actually assess fidelity in a multi-year intervention. And it becomes more complicated when not only is it multi-year, but you have multiple cohorts of participants. So each participant group is following a progression across the intervention period. And so often when you're thinking about fidelity, you want to combine by implementation year rather than by calendar year. So for instance, in 2023 and 24 of this particular intervention, the first cohort starts in their first year of their intervention, and they follow through 3 years of the intervention over the next 2 years. Meanwhile, the second cohort starts in the year that the first cohort has already moved into their second year of implementation. But when you think about fidelity, it makes more sense to look at the fidelity in the first year of implementation for both cohorts rather than trying to use the chronological year. And so when you start to get these complicated rollouts of interventions, you have many decisions to make about the best way to actually report on fidelity. Sorry, I've seen the chats come in. Report on fidelity across the same year of implementation. So this is another one of the, I think one of the issues that come up when we see people trying to give an overall assessment of fidelity of an intervention. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Particularly during COVID, we have come across the occasion when the intervention model actually changes on the ground while fidelity is being measured. Also, I think Carolyn spoke to the idea that people make adaptations to their intervention models, sometimes during a study, either an implementation study or an impact study. And so the researchers measuring fidelity have to deal with the fact that really it is not the same measure that makes sense for each of the time periods. And so to address this complexity, the researchers have to do a number of things to keep clear which version of the model they're looking at. So there needs to be a clear documentation of what has changed in the interventions logic model and then in the associated fidelity measure. There's likely the need to create a separate version of the fidelity measure for each separate version of the intervention model, and then track which version of the intervention model is being implemented each year over time. Then when finally at the end, the analysis and reporting of fidelity has to talk about how the researchers have to think about how to combine measures across different versions of the fidelity measure. And the next slide tries to show an example of what this might look like. So we'll go to the next slide. So for instance, in COVID, what often happened was on the left would be sort of the pre-COVID version where all of the training and coaching supports are delivered in person. And in this particular example of fidelity measure, full fidelity for an individual teacher is a score of at least 3. And at the school level, they might define it as 90% of the teachers have a score of 3. And that is because each teacher managed to get enough of each of the 3 types of supports for them to feel that they were fully delivered to that teacher. When the model had to take on virtual training rather than in-person training, the definitions changed. There was still the same sort of starter on summer training, but now it was online and defined differently. And these researchers added another piece to the fidelity, which is not just as the teacher online for the training, but do they have their video on? Which I think there were some issues about whether the online training really works in terms of people's engagement. And so the actual measure changes, the score changes, even though the fidelity at the end is still 90% of teachers, but now they are getting a score of 4. So you can see how the fidelity measure is very similar, but it's actually, depending on whether it was the virtual or in-person version, you're collecting different data and scoring it differently, and then actually determining how many teachers get the full amount. It uses a different metric. And so we'll go to the next slide. And I won't spend a lot of time going through it, but basically you're creating a kind of table that says for each year, for each school, what version were they using and whether they met the criterion of 90%. And so you can see that it becomes a complicated story at the end when you want to say overall in year 1, you can see that only one school met fidelity, the one school 1 that's in yellow. And it met it with the in-person version, and then over time, another school met it with the virtual version, and a different school met it with the in-person version. So you can sort of see over time that you have to keep track of which version and whether or not the fidelity threshold was met. So as things are adapted or changed during the life of a study of a intervention, keeping track of what version is being done and what are the markers of that is really an important part of being able to report accurately on fidelity. And finally, I want to talk just a minute about the fact that there's been very little, the last slide, very little done to really trying to understand variation in fidelity because there's been so much emphasis on is trying to come up with a measure that makes sense. And the next step is once I feel I have a measure that is a valid and at least adequately reliable measure, then looking at what variation in fidelity is related to is important next step in our research. Because you can see variation by the actual component being looked at. Some components may be easier to implement with fidelity. And when you look at what the barriers might be, you can ask yourself, would there be changes to the design or implementation that might help me achieve higher fidelity for that component? You can look at variation by setting or context, which we have had very little research on to date, which is, are there kinds of schools or sites or districts or even states where the conditions are such that the intervention was not able to be implemented with fidelity? And what are the barriers? What are the reasons that in one school they're able to get fidelity, in another school they're not? And these features begin to be able to help people improve or adjust their model or adjust the way they implement their model. And finally, there can be variation by participant characteristics. That is, some kinds of teachers might be able to achieve high fidelity, and other types of educators or even students may not be able to reach fidelity. So all of these kinds of variation, I think, are fair game when you're thinking about what helps either make or break ability of an intervention to be put in place with fidelity. And I know I'm at the end of my time. I want to just make one other statement, that in Carolyn's, the exhibit she showed, fidelity appears more than once. In other words, there are different forms of fidelity that we can talk about, measuring different aspects of the implementation of the model. And I think it's possible that these may be the kind of questions we'll take up in the discussion afterwards. So thanks. And I'm going to pass it on.
To me.
Zach.
Thanks, Barbara. So this is great that I'm looking in the chat, and there's some lively discussion already going on. So keep it coming in the chat. Ask your questions and participate in the chat. But now we're gonna pass the torch on to Catherine Darrow, who's gonna discuss addressing challenges when measuring intervention contrast.
Hi there. So I'm going to share a brief presentation on ways to address some challenges in measuring the intervention contrast. Next slide, please. And I'm going to focus mostly on two challenges that researchers face. So we can probably all admit that there are plenty of challenges, but in my experience, these are two of the most prominent. And in addition to that, I'll suggest some methods in addressing each challenge and then provide examples of how two recent studies approach them. The first challenge is identifying any factors that may influence the degree of intervention contrast that you would expect to find. So to do so, we would want to consider the setting and the context and the sample of the study, and think about any existing practices, structures, or policies that will likely persist in the control condition throughout the study timeframe. So let's just assume, for the sake of this presentation, that we're talking about a school-based intervention. And so in that case, you might ask yourself questions like, what are the current practices of service providers? And depending on the intervention, those providers could be literacy coaches, it could be teachers, principals, or even school cooks for that matter. You want to ask the questions, how are schools and classrooms organized? Who are the instructional leaders? Who are the decision makers? How are teachers and or coaches currently supported and trained? So what's the professional development plan for those folks? And even what are the local or state and even national policies that might drive program relevant implementation? So think about all of those things in identifying factors that could contribute to differences in the contrast. In addition, in addressing questions like this, you're better positioned to understand how the intervention could ultimately differ from the counterfactual or the business as usual. And that will lead to being able to identify specific constructs that you want to measure to reveal intervention contrasts wherever or whenever they occur. And then subsequently, those measures, those implementation measures used in treatment and control settings should be able to capture the constructs and then precisely highlight the contrasts. Next slide, please. So some of the suggestions I'm going to offer might feel like common sense, but I think it really does bear emphasizing that when you're capturing intervention contrast, the researchers, the study team really depends heavily on the knowledge of your implementing partners. And in the case of the examples I'll show you in school-based interventions, we really rely on the familiarity of district and school staff that they have about instruction, materials, resources, trainings that are specific to their settings. So I can't overstate the importance of really keying in and working with these partners. The first step is to identify and contact these people or people in the districts or schools who know information about things like the current state of professional development or the current state of instruction in their schools and districts. And you might also just clearly ask them, is there anything else that they know about their setting that relates to an intervention or your intervention and the implementation of that intervention? And it may certainly be something that your research team hasn't even considered. An additional step I would suggest is identifying any existing record-keeping systems that may provide information about both the intervention and the control groups. And some examples of that are attendance records or even agendas tied to professional development workshops. And those are professional development that your control teachers might be participating with. They could actually still be professional development opportunities that your treatment teachers continue to engage in. So it's questions like that, like what are the record keeping systems that you can kind of key into? Determine where those records exist and at which levels they're existing. Are they at the school or district level? And what your team needs to be able to do to gain access to them and keep access to them throughout the study timeframe. Documenting all the information that is necessary, but also revisiting your documentation and revisiting this information periodically, especially any of the factors that might influence the implementation or the contrast for that matter. I think over the years, we've learned that it's good practice to capture implementation fidelity across the years or the entire time frame of the study. That same approach needs to be thought or applied to the factors that could influence intervention contrast. So we wouldn't assume that the counterfactual or the control experience is remaining stagnant. So we would want to continue to measure the control program as well, the control condition as well. Next slide, please. So to give an example of this, the research team, which consisted of MDRC and Apt Associates, faced a similar challenge in our academic language intervention evaluation. Excuse me, and the report came out in 2022, just last year. That study in particular assessed the impact of an intervention on language development and reading in 4th and 5th graders. And the program that we tested included elements of professional development, like an ongoing coaching and the implementation of a year-long curriculum. And that curriculum was delivered by teachers in ELA and humanities classrooms. So for the ALI study team, it was really important for us to know what the approach and the schedule and even the content of each of these districts' plans trainings were. And it helped us to predict the likely contrast between treatment and control teachers, and then adjust our instruments and our data collection plans to capture those constructs accordingly. And the types of constructs we wanted to capture were like specific training on supporting language development in students. And if we could predict that, we then changed our instruments or modified our instruments to be able to capture that. And this allowed us to uncover any intervention contrast in those areas and any areas that were theoretically tied to changes in teacher practice and ultimately in student outcomes. We have specific questions like, what are the PD activities related to language and literacy instruction? What are existing ELA curriculum? How are English language learners in particular grouped in 4th and 5th grade classrooms? And even are ELA and humanities teachers typically assigned to self-contained classrooms, or are they in departmentalized instructions? And that kind of led us to understand better what kind of contrast we might be able to uncover as we went on. Next slide, please. So the second primary challenge relates to the development and use of measures of intervention contrast. So a measure or a set of measures used to capture the contrast needs to include some items that assess intervention-specific elements, as well as some more construct-based items that capture underlying pedagogical or instructional elements that could be present in the control condition. And the 2012 Nelson paper recommends this, and I think this is fairly, it's not common practice, but is highly encouraged. So whenever possible, research should at the very least consider any existing fidelity measures, which are often produced and used by program developers, sometimes curriculum designers, and even other interventionists. In some cases, a fidelity measure of a more structural based program could actually be effectively used in both conditions with little to no modification. And the app study team took this approach when we conducted an end-line evaluation of the McGovern-Dole school feeding literacy program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But for an intervention with a more process-driven or content-specific focus, an existing intervention-specific fidelity measure or any measures like that are likely to need some reworking to be able to effectively capture related and important processes in the control condition. And this is the approach we took in the ALI evaluation. Next. So to kind of dig into that example, for ALI evaluation, the study team borrowed extensively from an existing WordGen fidelity measure to capture fidelity to our tested program. And just to be a little bit more specific, the program's focused on intentional instructional practices like student-led activities like debates and focused on specific texts. So in and of itself, this very intervention-specific fidelity measure would not have been effective in capturing aligned instructional practices in the control classroom. It just wouldn't fit, to be quite honest. So in collaboration with the developers, the study team pulled out underlying constructs of the intervention. So for instance, we took the debate activity, which is a highlight of the curriculum each week or each 2 weeks. And this debate supports students to make claims and to justify their claims with evidence. We then developed indicators to capture those underlying constructs, those instructional constructs like argumentation, vocabulary, and use of evidence. And then we measured that in the control classrooms where the more specific intervention, specific items in the treatment classroom remain the same. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick screenshot of our fidelity checklist. And you'll see in the indicators 1 through 3 are nice examples of how we modified items to capture instructional practices that drive language development. And these are practices that are possibly evident in any context, regardless of curriculum. So looking at the first item on the left side of this measure, these items capture intervention-specific instruction, like teacher introduction of WordGen focus words per unit. Again, you wouldn't expect a controlled classroom or a teacher in a controlled classroom to use those particular words. But we modified that. And on the right side, you'll see that observers could capture if and when controlled teachers highlighted age or grade level vocabulary. So again, underlying construct of word knowledge and vocabulary. Next slide, please. And then ultimately, you can see that this two-pronged checklist was able to capture intervention contrast for each key construct that was made up of multiple indicators. But the graph here shows that we found only one area where there was a significant contrast, and that was in the instruction on vocabulary or the word knowledge area. And that in and of itself, that contrast drove the overall contrast. But there was no significant contrast related to other key instructional constructs. Next slide, please. So another approach for our apps McGovern-Dole impact evaluation in Mozambique, we use the same set of measures across treatment and comparison schools. So where with ALI, we had to kind of tweak and modify an existing measure. In this case, in Mozambique, we used the same measure in both conditions. And the McGovern-Dole project was mostly focused on providing school meals, instructional materials, and literacy supports. So because the Mozambique program implementation was less nuanced and more related to really just the sheer presence and absence of resources, a single measure could be used to capture implementation in all the sample schools. So an unmodified single measure was possible. Next slide, please. So you'll just see in this table, and it's in the report, shows that the implementation scores and any kind of associated contrast were captured through an unmodified set of surveys. And in this case, we see higher implementation in the treatment arms, as you would expect. But some of these contrasts are much less than we expected. And so even this is the third column in, you'll see in the literacy instruction, we see a small intervention contrast. And we were able to do that and find that using a single set of measures. And that's, I'm going to hand it over now.
All right, thank you, Catherine. The first two panelists have dug into the challenges of measuring fidelity and the experiences of both the treated and control group. And then the question is, what do you do once you have that data? How do you report it? And how do you start integrating implementation impact research to try and look at the causes? And we're going to pass this on to Howard Bloom so he can tackle this very complex issue. You're on mute, Howard.
Thank you, Lauren. Next slide, please. So the goal of my talk is to use a specific example of a study that I was involved in to illustrate how implementation analysis and impact analysis together can facilitate rigorous research on the causal agents, often called mediators, through which interventions produce their impacts. And this was a study of something we called small schools of choice. It was an intervention largely citywide in New York City, where they created from scratch a series of over 100 new small high schools, which had a certain kind of model, which I'll describe. So next slide. So the features and the impacts of these small schools of choice. First of all, we had an impact study design, a little unusual, especially at the time, but we had individual data for a large number of naturally occurring high school assignment lotteries. It turned out at that point in time, they were the city of New York was completely redoing the way kids applied and got assigned to high school. And part of that process was an algorithm that assigned them to high schools. And I won't go into the details, but it was an algorithm that assigned them to high schools based on their priority list of high schools in order and certain characteristics of the folks, but mostly, in most cases, just sheerly based on their priority schools, their first choice, second choice, third choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out there was an element of randomness at certain levels for certain schools in certain years to the assignment of entering ninth graders to those high schools. So this was very opportunistic. It actually was a study that more or less came to MDRC. We were asked by some of the folks who were creating and operating some of these new small schools of choice if there was a way that we could estimate impacts, and they happened to mention this new assignment process. And then it took us a long time, but we figured out there were actual lotteries going on, randomized lotteries. So these are naturally occurring randomized lotteries, not the kind of lotteries you have the charter schools and stuff like that, where parents and children are sitting around trying to figure out in person on the day assignment was out. They signed up for lotteries. This was just going on beneath the radar as part of the assignment process, just business as usual. So our sample was 66 particular small schools of choice. Again, these are brand new schools started from scratch, with a total of 12,000 randomized entering ninth grader from up to 6 entering cohorts. And we're finding randomized lotteries wherever we could inside of those schools and those cohorts. The outcome measure we use, we estimated impacts on other outcome measures for our original research, but the measure we used for our integration of implementation research and impact research was high school graduation rates. The percentage of kids who graduated within 5 years of being assigned to their first high school. The impact predictors we used were a bunch of school feature contrasts. So every impact predictor in this analysis was a treatment and control group contrast in a feature of their high school. And basically what the lotteries did for us, it enabled us to, for each kid in the lottery, we could estimate their outcomes using administrative data, their graduation rate. And then in addition, we could we use the school feature data sources we had, were annual administrative records on some very good teacher and student surveys, annual surveys going on for the city of New York, by the city of New York, having nothing to do with the fact that we wanted to use this information. It was very, very fortunate. This sort of the stars align, both on the impact side to get rigorous impact estimates, and on the implementation side to get what we felt were very good measures of things like impact predictors identified, school leadership, quality of school leadership, teacher empowerment, academic rigor, personalized learning, and other key features of the SSE model. And the SSE model and mantra was rigor, academic rigor, relevance, that didn't play out as important, relevance to the world that kids are going to graduate into, and relationships, which is absolutely central to these small schools focusing on very close relationships between teachers, students, and parents, the smallness helping to make that happen. So rigor, relevance, and relationships, that's the model. Next slide, please. So our two research questions, and now listening to Barbara, there's a third research question, which we actually followed up and didn't specify a priori. One, which high school features are promising levers for increasing graduation rates? That's one question we asked. And then another, which high school features help to produce the SSE impacts that we saw? Okay. Our third research question, which we talked about but never stated as a research question, it was a fidelity question, which is, the rigor, relevance, of relationships. How clear was the treatment contrast? How wide, how strong was the treatment contrast in terms of those specified, pre-specified features of these schools? Next slide. So this little diagram encapsulates all of this. This is a diagram, it's a common diagram used to explain what a mediator is and how to estimate mediational effects. A mediator is a causal agent through which a treatment or an intervention causes the effects on the outcome. So in this case, we've got treatment assignment is randomizing kids to SSCs, and they're not all the same SSCs. There's 68 different SSCs, or some other school that was on their list in the New York City high school, public high school system, all public schools. Okay, so random assignment gives you the schools that kids are assigned to and the differences in those schools. The differences in those schools gives you this example uses one school feature, school leadership, and a good measure of it. There's a treatment control difference on average between, or site by site, or lottery by lottery, and between treatment and control, the quality of their school leadership. Then that gamma, that I don't know if you can see this, but the gamma on the upper left-hand side, going from T to M, okay, is literally the impact of treatment assignment on the mediator. In other words, it's the size of the treatment and control group difference in the quality of school leadership in this example. That's a measure of treatment fidelity, although we never called it that, we never talked about it that way. But that gamma is actually a measure of treatment fidelity. Now, then the next question we were asked, a research question, had to do with delta, which is on the right side, the upper right side here, which is what's the effect of the mediator on graduation rates? Okay, we do a little dance to get that, but that parameter is the mediator effect. You can see the mediator effect down here is defined. Delta, what's the effect of the mediator on the outcome? That basically helps us to answer the size of delta for different mediators, for different features of high school, tries to help us answer the question, what mediators, what features of high schools are promising levers for improving high schools. So delta, literally estimating delta, addresses the research question, what are promising levers for improving outcomes for almost uniformly disadvantaged students. Okay, then so the product of gamma and delta, gamma times delta, is called the indirect effect. It's the effect of the intervention. It's the effect of T on Y through M. Okay, it's the effect of assignment to an SSC as opposed to some other alternative kind of school on Y through the median. So that's gamma times delta. That's called the indirect effect of treatment on the outcome through the median. Finally, the direct effect, lambda, on the bottom there, is the effect of treatment on the mediator through every treatment effect on the outcome through everything other than school leadership. Everything other than school leadership. And then the total effect, which is the overall total impact down to bottom, is the indirect effect lambda plus the direct effect lambda plus the indirect effect gamma times delta. That's the logic of everything we do in terms of trying to estimate the effect of causal agents of interventions. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just, and it's an amazingly simple regression, okay, which has some amazingly powerful but not almighty properties. So beta hat here is the estimated impact for SSCJ. Okay, particular SSC, we had 68. What's the impact on graduation rates for SSCJ? Okay, gamma hat is the estimated mediator contrast for SSCJ. That's what I said before, it's like a measure of fidelity, but it's a contrast. Okay, so this little regression then is basically, it says beta is equal to some intercept, lambda, plus some coefficient, delta, times the treatment
And
contrast.
that's 914,
Whoop.
260, 240.
Somebody's talking. So next slide, please. All right, so what we learned was information about what features of high schools seem to have more or less impact on the outcomes of high school students, and what features seem to differentiate these SSCs from their counterfactual alternatives, and what the indirect effect of SSCs on high school graduation rates was. So the lessons we learned was, in general, we're integrating implementation and impact research can provide a plausible basis for exploring the causal agents. This is exploratory analysis through which successful interventions produce their impacts. Now, this type of research requires, one, valid and precise measures of the causal agents. We were very lucky to have found some very well measured, consistently over years, consistently across schools, consistently with respect to the specific causal agents, school features studied from administrative record. You need, second requirement, a rigorous impact estimation design. We were able to find, honest to God, random assignment of students to SSCs or their alternatives. So we had sort of the gold standard for internal validity on the impact design. We needed numerous sizable study sites. Okay, we had 68, which in this world for a cross-site study is pretty good, sizable sites. And you need a clear focus on treatment contrast. We're really trying to do a causal analysis of the features of the school features. What were their impacts on the impacts on graduation rates of these kinds of schools? So you need a clear focus on treatment contrast. We didn't just measure the features of the treatment schools. It was absolutely essential to have the treatment contrast, the treatment and control group contrast. Now, I'm not going to, unless there's more time, this research is imperfect for two really important reasons. One is that little regression I showed you earlier is just like any other regression you're going to run, which it's as good as the inclusion of the it's as good as your inclusion of the relevant predictors in the models. In this case, it's as good as your inclusion of features of the SSCs that actually, honest to God, impacted graduation rates. And if you have left out mediators in your analysis, it's classic left one-on-one regression, left out variable bias in a regression. So this is exploratory research. It's not important. It's not perfect, It's very important, but it is exploratory, and that's left out variables bias. In addition, a lot of these mediators, and many times, I mean, I've been involved in 3 very large studies of this sort, not identical, very different, but of this sort. Mediators tend to be correlated with the mediator contrasts tend to be correlated across schools. And so separating their separate effects in a multivariate version of that little regression I showed you gets to be difficult when the predictor variables in your regression are correlated with each other. That's a problem of imprecision. It gets the standard errors on your estimates of the mediator effects, the effect of the mediators on the outcomes, get very large when you have correlated mediator contrast. You can't separate the effects of different mediators on the outcomes. So then the last thing I'll say is, what about a study, a single site study in the context of future meta-analyses? Well, in order to, this kind of work requires cross-site rigorous impact studies with good implementation analysis, and cross study rigorous impact studies with rigorous treatment contrast measures. Now, if you're a single site and a single study, how do you contribute to the enterprise of integrating implementation and impact analysis to figure out what makes interventions work? One, you should focus on, to the best you can, focus on widely used implementation and impact measures, so that to facilitate down the road future cross-site pooling. Now, that's really an issue for our field, to help develop measures that folks doing any studies, be they multiple site or single sites, can use, so that those measures can be replicated in other sites, so that down the road you can pool across as many large sample sites as possible to get around some of these 2 imperfections, the unmeasured mediator contrast and the correlated mediator contrast. And then lastly, for the individual study itself, please report the estimates and standard errors for your impact estimates, which you will, although not everybody does, but by now hopefully they do, and the mediator contrast by site. You got to have them both. You got to have the estimated impact on the outcome and the of treatment assignment, and the estimated impact of treatment assignment on the mediator, on the school feature. You got to have those both and their standard errors, and they have to be measured similarly across studies in order to start pooling across studies, which is where our field is ultimately going to get some purchase on sorting these things out. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Howard. That is a great transition and a wonderful discussion of what it takes to put these pieces together from implementation research and looking at variation and impacts. We're now going to move to a broader discussion with the panelists. And I'll start out with a single question that we had planned in advance, and then I'll work through some of the questions that have come up in the chat. And so let's start out with this question. One of the motivations for developing the guide was to address gaps in publicly available resources and in graduate training for impact researchers across a wide range of disciplines. In your experience, which topics or topic in the guide are areas where you think impact researchers, graduate students, and research funders could most benefit from learning more? And why did you choose this topic? It may be the topic you focused on in your comments, or you can choose a different one too, and you can choose multiple topics. And Barbara, I'd like to start with you, if you can share your thoughts.
Sure, it's a fair start. I have lots of ways to say this because I've been so embedded in this for so many years. But I'm going to bring up one in particular that I don't think was raised or didn't come up in any of our discussion, and that is, I think in the world I'm in, there's an intense interest in developing models that seem to work on average in many contexts. I think would be national models And if you remember the program that I'm involved with, the I3 and the IR, they started with what they felt were 4 national models: KIP, Teach for America, Reading Recovery, and Success for All. And the sense was, I think they were looking for models that they could say would work in almost any context, mostly for at-risk kids. But I think the promise of that has been really hard to achieve, partly because the more we know about these models, the less clear it is that they are really going to work for everybody in the same way. And now we have implementation data entering the picture as another source of variation, that we're learning that getting high quality implementation across many different contexts is hard. And I think what Howard is saying, in a way, to me and to us, is we know this, but we have to figure out what it is that is causing this variation. And is it things that we can create policies about, things we can create standards about, or is it the, to me, the inevitable pull of local conditions that we're never going to be able to say on average? And I mean, we're not as naive, I think, as we used to be about the fact that there could be an intervention that will work well for everybody across contexts. And I think one of the problems is when we go out and talk to schools, districts and schools, people are very interested in data that are about their kind of place. That I could show them many kinds of impact estimates, but if I can't say, well, we've looked at schools like yours or with students like yours, they don't find this very compelling. And I think that's going to be a big barrier to scale up. So I feel this all intersects with trying to move beyond the single site study and trying to understand in our field, are there answers that are sort of generalizable? Because we've not been very good at coming up with answers that I think teachers and schools feel are very helpful. So for me, that's why I think this implementation data is so important in trying to help people understand, is this a useful model for them? So that's just one of the many reasons I find it really compelling to work with people about implementation.
All right, great, thank you. Kat, what are your views on this?
Well, I looking at the guide, and I'm glad it came out. I'm sorry I didn't write it. But I have to say the section 2 in particular was just really is very valuable, and it's specifically around like understanding the intervention model and understanding the components of the intervention. And it is related to what I presented on, because it's really the precursor to understanding what's going on in the control conditioning and seeing what the aligned practices are there, and then ultimately measuring the intervention contrast. So if you're not going through that process that you kind of write like very clearly and nicely in section 2, you don't get the reward of having the ability to do that, and to really highlight the contrast. And I absolutely love the 4 dimensions of like focusing on content, quantity, mode, and quality. And that's like a really, in terms of folks who are either new or actually have been engaged in this kind of work, it's very helpful to just think about that, and just to make sure you're covering that in addition maybe to other components and dimensions, but covering those 4, I think, is a really, it's a nice guide.
Thank you. Howard, what are your views? What sections do you think, or what topics that the guide addresses do you think impact researchers, funders, and others would most benefit from digging into further or giving more attention to in their work?
Well, I actually alluded to that or spoke to that very last thing I said, which is basically measuring consistently across study within and across sites within studies and across studies over time, some key indicators that are felt to be causal agents of the student success and or failure. And it reminds me, Carolyn, of the first study we did together virtually exactly 2 decades ago, where it was in a different field. It was basically work welfare, but it built directly on MDRC's work over about a decade. 3 very large multi-site trials where some folks at MDRC, Jim Riccio among them, helped to develop the implementation measures for the first study game, and were very careful about that and used it. And then the next 2 studies used those measures, not identically. I mean, you're always making changes, you're always adding and everything, but they maintained across those studies. This is one organization which has an ability to kind of control the way they do things. But in that setting, they created something that you and I just walked into, which was, you know, like a pot of gold in terms of consistently measured treatment contrast, consistently measured outcomes, consistently measured characteristics of the population and characteristics of the contest. All of this stuff that you talk about in your manual, they were consistently measured across time. That's what it's going to take to make this go. Now, I say that, I say, we can't have thought police. I mean, you know, on our field. On the other hand, if we don't have something guiding what we all collect, we won't be able to benefit from what we could really benefit from.
Well, Howard, you're almost suggesting a standardization in a way of at least a minimum set of characteristics that people measure and instruments they might use to capture implementation at I think in that model there are 2 kinds of fidelity. One is the fidelity sort of with which the supports are delivered, but probably the more important one in this case is the fidelity of the actual interactions and processes in classrooms and schools. But unless we have some standardization, which we have had very little of, it's really, as you say, within an organization where the same researchers may have been developing the design, you have a better chance. But across all of it, if you think of the amount of data we've collected and the opportunities that could have been there to do this kind of analysis, I'm part of it, so I get to say it. You only get to say bad things if you're part of the bad part. I mean, in a way, we squandered our opportunities in a sense, because I don't know, I'm not sure we haven't gone through the golden age of data use. You know, it's even harder and harder to get data, you know, from districts and schools and parents. And I just feel that we had a chance if we'd had a little more thoughtful thinking of, you know, we pushed ourselves to do a little more standardization, because it is really hard. It's like apples and oranges whenever you're trying to do a meta-analysis, and that just makes you feel frustrated at the end that we didn't take advantage of this costly kind of data collection and the cost to the people involved in it, and our lack of answers at the end, which is really frustrating for people who participate, I think.
Right, and I want to be clear, I'm talking about mindful standardization, not bureaucratic standardization. If you learn things along the way, you change things if you must change them. You don't hold on to them because you started out that way and you need to continue that way.
Right.
And I think it's a collective action, you know, there are collective action issues. So it's hard to know kind of where those are more easily solved within an organization than across organizations and things like that. One of the challenges in doing this work and in talking about this work that we encountered when creating this guide, and this was reflected in a couple of the questions, is the challenge of terminology and definitions. And even something like fidelity, intervention fidelity, implementation fidelity, what it means, how it's described, what it encompasses, seems like it should be easy, is not. Probably everybody on this call knows. And so if we didn't feel like this was a place to navigate through that whole discussion, but instead to be clear about how we were defining it, we defined it based on the Mike Weiss, Howard Bloom, Tom Brock article. That was also where we pinned some of the terminology we used. You may have seen Howard smiling earlier, Kat, when you mentioned content, quantity, mode, and quality. Those categories came from the Weiss, Bloom, Brock article. The implementation science literature and other literatures have different terms and definitions for those categories, including quality, including engagement. And we really tried hard in this guide to document those. And there was a question about why we use the term support components instead of strategies, which is a term used by and in the implementation science literature, in which we provide a crosswalk to in the guide. So, you know, one thing that is challenging in the work is really navigating through, and we think especially for people who kind of need to understand how to do or how implementation research can be conducted, that can be a barrier sometimes to engaging in the work. And so we're hoping that this is a way to access some of the literature and with further resources. There have been a lot of questions in the chat and discussion about fidelity. So Barb, these came in while you were talking. And it's interesting to me that of the three panelist focuses, that was what generated a lot of questions and a lot of pondering. And before we get to some of those, I'd like to ask the panelists, why do you think that is? What is it about fidelity that activates a discussion when it's possible to have great fidelity, however defined, but no impacts? Why is fidelity such a focus, and should it be as much of a focus as it is? Anybody want to take that first?
I don't think there's a sort of a right answer to that question, but I think that for so many years our implementation, I mean, maybe up until maybe 2010 is where I sort of think this all began. I mean, maybe or a little earlier than that. Our implementation studies were pretty descriptive and qualitative, and were very much stories about implementation, which were very interesting to people, particularly the people whose story it was about. But people didn't read much about other people's implementation studies. They were very individual. They were not easy to see a theme in. And I think that when it began to be clear that there was, I mean, I think the growth of logic models really pushed this along when you began to think, well, there are pieces of this picture that you can actually begin to think about measuring that I thought maybe you were bringing up your picture, but no, it seems to be something more exciting than that on the screen right now. Okay,
that was someone's mistake. And
I think there was a push to be more systematic about this in grant programs. I don't know, but they had to be preceded by somebody telling them it was important to put it in a grant program. But to me, fidelity is the I don't know, like to me, it's the natural question that people want to ask about what's necessary, if not sufficient, to get an impact at the end. And so I think with some of the measurement of classroom, like the class, some of the measures of what was really going on, it began to push people to be able to think, well, I can actually measure that. I can actually know what's going on. And then they hit the inevitable problem, which is, well, I can't measure that in the control classroom. So I think it's been a conundrum about a really important piece of data that everybody wants and they can't get. And now on top of it, people are asking for it. So I think it's the natural movement towards a more standardized view of implementation, which, I mean, there are implementation reports like collecting dust in people's drawers that people spent, you know, I don't know who it was. I think it may have been Steve Barnett who once said, I think we collect 90% more data than we ever really report. And I think that was more about implementation data than about outcome data. And so I think people got sort of tired of having data that they couldn't draw any conclusions from. But that's just my opinion. And now I think there's sort of a tsunami of interest in it. And I think it's actually really hard. And the idea in your picture, which I think was really important, is that there are two kinds of fidelity we're really talking about. And we don't even know which one of those is the lever. Is it really the kind of things that I think I can give with my money. I can actually spend my money and put into place these kind of supports. Or is it then what's the resulting change in the classroom? And I was really interested in Howard's example, because he had an example where the contrasts were not only just natural contrasts in the world and school leadership, but it also aligned with the intervention, the actual small schools. And that's not always true either. So I guess I don't know the answer, Carolyn, but I think it is now probably the predominant discussion we have in EIR and I3 in implementation with evaluators. It is the predominant discussion. How do I measure fidelity? How do I then of course the question, how do I understand how fidelity makes a difference? And they want to be like, biologists. They want to have a model. They want to be able to test whether each step happens. And if it doesn't happen, why not? And then what should we change? And they want to see it as really a logical progression, which I don't think we ever thought of before in the way we thought about, educational practice. So other people may have other opinions in the audience about why fidelity is so kind of on everyone's mind right now.
Yeah. Kat, do you have anything you'd like to share on this?
Yeah, I guess it's pretty popular because it depends on what questions you're asking. And I have to say, like, my understanding and my value of it has morphed over the years, starting with fidelity to a specific intervention, and whether if it's low fidelity, it's really a sufficient test of that intervention. But now I think my thinking is more like what's working in instructional practice or in curricula, and what are the underlying factors, what are the underlying strategies or components that it's working. And so I've become kind of more agnostic about interventions and interventions fidelity specifically, and more focused on what's the contrast between the current business as usual, like practice, and whatever is driving this new adopted strategies or curricula. Like, what is it that's changing practice, not necessarily the specific intervention, but what are the things that are driving it, kind of the underlying constructs. So you can use fidelity, obviously, to answer all those questions, I think. So that's, I think, why it's broadly applicable.
Thank you. I want to ask a follow-up question, but Howard, is there anything on this that you'd like to chime in on?
I was going to, but why don't you ask your question?
Okay, I'll come to you first, and this is a way that this builds on it. Some of the questions in the chat have been things like about fidelity in particular, been fidelity thresholds often seem arbitrary, and do they have a fundamentally arbitrary nature? Sometimes it's difficult to say that one is objective. What if they change? When should we do them? How much information are we getting from actual fidelity thresholds, from a continuous measure? How do these relate to a theory of change? When fidelity measures are there and they may not sort of be reflecting whatever a theory of change is underneath, how much information are they really telling us? So those are a couple of the ideas that have come up during the chat that I think build into this, what are we understanding with various fidelity measures? Howard, do you want to reflect on that or work in whatever comments you wanted to say before?
Well, actually, they mailed immediately. So I've been sitting here thinking, my theory, which I developed over the course of the last hour, so it's been deeply thought out. My theory here is that people who have to implement things are really going to care about how well they implemented what they set out to implement. And if you're coming from, this is neither good, bad, or otherwise, but if you're coming from a mindset, you're trying to get certain things achieved, implementation achieved in this world, you want good measures of achievement to guide your next steps, to guide your decision. And if you're coming from that focus, fidelity would be like everything in a way. Am I getting to where I wanted to get? And so it makes all the sense in the world. Now, I came from a very different place, many different places. And I spent the first half of my career working on impacts and better ways of estimating impacts. In the second half of my career, first trying to look at variation in impacts, and then trying to look at covariation with impacts. In other words, how implementation co-varies with impacts. And so I come at it very differently. And so thresholds of fidelity to me don't really mean anything in particular, but the contrast is what I care about, because it's the treatment contrast that's driving the actual mediator effect and your ability to identify mediator effect. And so I, in my, for my purposes, I'm not trying to manage the implementation of something. You know, if you're managing something, you're trying to do something rather different. I'm trying to understand cause and effect about the implementation of something. And so from the cause and effect part, those thresholds, I don't think really tell me what I want to know. It's the contrast itself. It's the magnitude of the contrast itself, which is kind of how I backed into that third research question, which I never really stated in any of my slides. But as I sat and thought about what Barbara was saying, I said, well, that's my third research question, because we did make a point in that paper, which was really interesting. You know, how different were SSCs from other schools, i.e., in terms of the relevance, rigor, and relationships, their model. That's all about fidelity. So I just sort of backed into it. You know, Barbara, you walked into it, presumably.
Right, but Howard, now I'm looking for thresholds for the contrast. Like, how big does the contrast have to be for me to think it's going to show up in a difference in outcome? So we've just moved the threshold question away from just the implementation, but to the two versions of the implementation. And again, I do think we should, you know, that's what we should collect data on. How big a difference do any of these things make to actual outcomes for students? And
precisely.
That's a really, I mean, my view is we don't have a big wedge to start with. You know, with the things that education could do for kids, the proportion of their outcomes that is due to their educational experience isn't 100%. And what percent we have now is going to be affected by the difference in what we give them. So I don't, you know, I would really like to start to develop a science of how big that contrast has to be to make a difference, Howard. And I don't, like in yours, I don't know how big the contrasts were. Like, how different, how'd you measure?
Right. Well, a step toward that, I'm not convinced that thresholds are necessarily where it's at. But what I'm trying to estimate is the coefficient of a treatment contrast impacts on a treatment contrast. In other words, as you go up per unit on the treatment contrast, you know, as the difference in leadership for treatment and controls goes up by a unit measured through surveys, you know, by how much do the impacts go up? And that's a continuous relationship that you can use that to say, well, if the contrast were this big, the impact would be that big, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, without setting any necessarily thresholds on it. But you could use it as guidance if you were in a management position.
Right.
You could use it as guidance for pushing for a threshold.
How much of an effort do you have to make? Like, can I just throw a curriculum at teachers and it's going to be fine, or do I have to do something to make that contrast really different? Like, really get them to do it. And I mean, there's so many questions, but I think you're going down the right road, Howard. And I think fidelity by itself is not enough. So, well, I guess we're getting shut down anyway.
Yeah.
No, built off of Barbara. All right. Thank you for your responses to that, Lauren. I'll pass it over to you.
We hate to be the party pooper, but our time has run out. But we thank the panelists. Thanks to Carolyn. Thanks to SRI and APAM and IES. And if you have additional questions, here's all of our email addresses. We look forward to hearing from you. If you read the guide and you have additional thoughts or questions, we're happy to answer those questions as well. So thanks for everyone who attended. I appreciate all of the folks who wrote in the chat as well. So thank you all and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.